It's time for the podcast, which is all about the world of marketing on television through TV shopping networks and infomercials. Are we on the air? I'm your host, Shawn Wilsey, and for over 29 years, I've hosted shows on cable shopping networks, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in sales, and now I want to be your guide into this world, explaining how it works, why it works, what doesn't work, and introduce you to some of the people who are making it the success that it is today.
The Guiding Light. Brought to you by the makers of P&G Soap, largest selling bar laundry soap in America today.
The Reverend Dr. John Rutledge was a liberal, sectarian clergyman in the little Chicago suburb of 5 Points. I warned him, not good at reading. Anyway, week after week, parishioners from all faiths came to the little church of the 5 Points to hear Dr. Rutledge speak out against the insidiousness of racial prejudice, the horror of war, and the injustice of poverty. But Dr. Rutledge's influence on the townspeople extended far beyond his weekly sermons. In the window of his study, his reading lamp, known fondly as the friendship lamp, would burn brightly, a signal to those in need who would seek his counsel. This lamp was a constant and comforting presence as Dr. Rutledge himself, and was known to all in 5 Points as the Guiding Light. That is the backstory behind a soap opera which ran for, over 70 years on television and radio, called The Guiding Light. And what you just heard was the opening to an episode of that show from January 4th, 1939. 82 years ago. Over that, almost 83 as we record this show. Why on earth am I playing that? Well, couple reasons, but most importantly for us and for our conversations, if we want to understand, because this is a podcast about infomercials, television shopping, home shopping, the 2-minute commercials where you call an 800 number, direct response television. To understand the financials of how this works, we literally have to go back to 1939 and understand a radio serial, a daytime drama, as we would call it today, or a soap opera, as it has been known forever. Because to understand, because remember, part of my opening spiel is I want to be your guide into this world, explaining how it works, why it works, and what doesn't work. The how it works part is the economics of how this works. And to understand that, we literally have to go back to 1939. And we have to have a conversation about a soap opera from January 4th, 1939. I promise we're going to connect the dots, and this will all make sense in the end. It's going to take a few episodes, but this will all make sense when all is said and done. For anybody who wants to be a host in this industry, on television in this industry, have their products sold in an infomercial or on television, we literally have to go back this far. Why is that? Let me explain. Because the whole idea of radio and television is we need to sell you something in order to survive. And that's why you have the NBCs and the CBSs going back to the days of radio. ABC came later, they came in television. But they started in radio. And for the networks to survive, they have to make money. How do they make money? Putting on shows. Who pays for those shows? The advertisers. But in the case of The Guiding Light, it was a little different scenario how that made money. Because it was not a product of CBS needing programming. I mean, CBS needed programming. What it was the result of an advertising agency needing to sell soap. That's the whole reason the soap opera was born. Let's go back to this audio clip and continue where we left off. Dig that music.
Say, when you hear that a radio program is the most popular program on the air, you want to hear it, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yes, and you probably try to see the most popular movies, too. Sure,
Absolutely.
everybody does. Because when a radio program, a movie, or anything else becomes that popular, there's usually a mighty good reason. Yes, and that's why
I love this guy's voice. Say, yes, sure. Love it. This is classic announcer. I honestly wish we had more of this today on television and in radio. We don't. Austin, Texas, we have Gossip Greg as a DJ. I could do 2 episodes just on that subject alone. Give him a weekend shift. Fine. Little morning character. But anyway.
you ought to try P&G soap. For when it comes to the most popular bar laundry soap, it's P&G without a doubt. That's right. Every wash day,
That's
thousands
right.
of women are changing to P&G soap. It's the most popular bar laundry soap in America today. Yes, and there is a mighty good reason. Sure. P&G has won the title of most popular because here's a soap that's made especially to get clothes white. Remember, I said it gets clothes white. And I don't mean a grayish white nor a dingy yellowish white. No, ma'am.
No.
P&G gets your clothes a gleaming, snowy white. And without any hard scrubbing or boiling either.
Again, we could just analyze that just as a quality commercial. I mean, the script is beautifully written. He's got all the adjectives in there that you want. He's stressing the aspect of white, gleaming white. It's a beautifully written commercial. And his voice, I'm serious when I say that's one of the things missing from radio today. And announcers today, whether it's on television or a game show or a talk show. I mean, what was his name? Stuttering John, for crying out loud, became the announcer on The Tonight Show during the Leno years. But anyway, so the economics and how did this work and why did this start out this way? It was an advertising agency that handled the Procter & Gamble account. You heard him mention P&G. P&G is Procter & Gamble, a giant corporation that owns so much. But back then, Procter & Gamble was mainly about soap, and they thought, okay, how are we supposed to sell soap? We have this new thing called radio. Is there a way we can use this to sell soap? And they had created a cooking show, Crisco Cooking Talks on radio, where people just read recipes. Okay, I'm not maybe an expert in programming. I think I am in marketing and advertising, but that sounds like a pretty bad idea for a radio show where recipes are read. Okay, so they got into this whole idea of, well, let's create a drama. Let's create an ongoing story. And the story for The Guiding Light was born. And it became a success. And housewives were tuning in. Again, this is geared all towards women now. Because, and I'm not stereotyping, this is the way things were in 1939. The men were working, the women were at home, taking care of the house, doing the laundry, doing the cooking, doing the cleaning, doing all the things, utilizing the products that Procter & Gamble wanted to sell. So you had problem solved for the radio stations because the radio stations needed programming. This was not the time of play records. This was the time of entertain, put on shows. Maybe live orchestras would come in and perform. And so what Procter & Gamble did was they realized there's a market here for us to sell our products. Plain and simple. That's all they wanted to do. They just wanted to sell products. If they could have, it would have been a 15-minute, because those soap operas were 15 minutes. It would have been a 15-minute commercial for Procter & Gamble soaps. But how do you get Sally Housewife to tune in every day just to listen to a 15-minute commercial for Procter & Gamble soaps? So that was the birth of the soap opera. How was that different from the other radio model? Well, the other business model, I shouldn't even say business model, but the other way programs were put on the radio was by having the show sponsored by something. See, this is the reverse. This is a sponsor creating a show, whereas I use Jack Benny as the example because he was such a success on radio, and that went into television, and he went well into the 1960s with his TV show. And NBC wanted him for their Blue Network, which is what they called one of their radio networks, for a radio show. So they had to find a sponsor. So now, rather than the sponsor creating the show, you have the creators and the producers needing to find an advertiser. So that's when they start knocking on doors and saying, hey, we need a and why do I have the ad men talking like gangsters? I don't know. That's the voice that came out. But you have the advertisers now being approached by the producers of the show saying, would you like to sponsor this show? And they say, well, yes or no. Jell-O said yes. Jell-O was one of his longest-running sponsors for his show. And in fact, just to give you a little idea, this is the same year, 1939. Here is a quick introduction into Jack Benny's program.
J-E-L-L-O. The Jell-O program starring Jack Benny with Mary Livingston, Phil Harris, Kenny Baker, and yours truly, Don Wilson. The orchestra opens the program with Fine and Dandy.
Okay. And the show begins. So they start the show and play some music, and then Jack comes out. They do some comedy, and actually some of these age very well. Some don't, some do. But some of his episodes are still very, very funny. And that was the traditional business model for radio and then into television. Now, things had to change when you had the soap operas and, to a degree, the TV shows. And I'm going to do a whole separate episode on the 1950s change as television had to change in the 1950s. But the soap operas, they had the same business model. Now, not completely, but by and large, because Procter & Gamble would go on to not just create The Guiding Light, they went on to create Search for Tomorrow, As the World Turns, Another World, some of the longest-running soap operas. Obviously, they didn't all hit the hits that some of those hit, because some of those run 50 years, Guiding Light, I think, 70 years. They're all gone today, though. All of them have been canceled. And that, again, the economics, which we'll get to. So, come the 1950s, radio is still around through the early 50s, but obviously television is where things are heading, especially as more and more homes get TV. So Procter & Gamble, who, again, they own these shows. If they want to make money, they need these shows on the networks. So they're sitting there scratching their head saying, well, what do we do now? Well, obviously we transition to television. And we don't talk like gangsters anymore. And so they make the switch. Now, obviously, TV is going to start becoming a whole new expensive proposition. Now we have cameras, and we have lighting, and we have all these costs we didn't have before. So Procter & Gamble soon realizes that this business model doesn't hold up anymore. We still own the shows. We are still producing the shows. We are still hiring the writers and all this. But we're going to need some help. That is when the multiple sponsor thing started. Now, they were still the main sponsor, and you would still hear their products pushed. In fact, we're going to jump to the 1980s quickly here. And here is how you would hear an opening to the long-running soap opera, Another World. Music's evolved a bit.
Another World. This part is brought to you by New Era Plus. With more proteins to clean more stains.
So again, they still have their product featured prominently. Now, there would have been other commercials. There might have been a commercial for a Hershey's candy bar or A&W root beer or something else, a product they don't own and that they're not responsible for, but obviously right there up front. Hey, folks, you're about to watch Another World, and here's who's making it possible. This detergent. Does Era? I don't think I should have done this homework. I don't think Era exists anymore. I haven't seen that. I remember using it in college, and I don't think that still exists. Procter & Gamble still does, but that product may not. Anyway, so they have this business model. Works obviously now bringing in other sponsors through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And then the soap opera ratings start to wane in the 1990s. The 80s was the heyday. There was, at one point, over 15 soap operas between network television, daytime network television, and syndication. That doesn't even count the primetime ones like the Dallas and the Knots Landing and all that. Soap operas were extremely profitable. Remember, on a previous show, I talked about this, how NBC, when their primetime shows were struggling, they stayed in business because of the successful ratings of their game shows and their soap operas. They ran 4 hours a day of soap operas, and that paid the bills. Or maybe it was 3 hours game shows, 3 hours soap operas. Some of the networks did 4. NBC did 3 at the time. So as Procter & Gamble was getting the success, remember these shows started as 15 minutes. They went to a half hour. Another World became the first 1-hour soap opera in the 1970s, 74. And then others started expanding to an hour because, okay, we're making more money on this. Well, the 1990s hit, and now you have Oprah. You have The Richard Bay Show, Jerry Springer. You have Jenny Jones, Ricky Lake, all these talk shows that are dead cheap to produce versus a soap opera. And people are liking it. And they're tuning out. And they never came back. And so slowly that business model started to go away. Another World, was one of the first to go in 1999. And once that one left, the handwriting was on the wall for the rest. And Procter & Gamble slowly said, this is it. We're done with this. We can't make any more money on this. It was fun while it lasted. Guiding Light got canceled. As the World Turns. Search for Tomorrow, actually, I don't even think made it into the 1990s. But it's just, and so eventually Procter & Gamble pulled the plug on the soap opera, and that pretty much marked the end of the soap opera. Now, I mean, it's death story. I've compacted down quite a bit, but that really was it. How does this impact what we do today? Well, ownership of a means of selling product. Procter & Gamble had an advertiser who, and by the way, they produced all these themselves. The networks, they didn't go to NBC and say, hey, we need you to produce this for us. We are producing this. NBC or CBS, I think they might have had one on ABC at the time. Later on, the networks had nothing to do with that. It was all the advertisers doing. So this was the first time you had an advertiser really producing a big budget way of selling something. And that is, in a nutshell, what QVC and Home Shopping Network and the big networks spend massive amounts of money to do. It's a very big production. Is that business model sustainable is the big question. And in the coming weeks and months, we're going to start to answer that. By no means speculating as to what will happen for sure, but it costs a lot of money when you see a $20 tchotchke. Well, there's not a lot of tchotchkes being sold. For those who don't know what tchotchke is, just, it's like a little figurine or something. You don't see a lot of that anymore. But a $20 pair of slacks, it costs a hell of a lot of money in production time, production costs, people, and everything in order to sell that item. And I think down the road, that's one of the questions that will be asked. Procter & Gamble eventually said, hey, not worth it. That's it. Lock the door behind you. We're out of here. Got out of this means of selling their product. Now, are they still commercials on advertisers on TV? Absolutely. Not as much as they used to be, though. You might be surprised. Absolutely, though. They still are advertisers. It's just they're not spending the money to produce their own shows just to sell their products. Because at the end of the day, that's what it was about. It was about selling their products, the ones they had a vested interest in. We will continue this because once you get into the 1950s and television comes into play and your TV shows, and especially the primetime game shows, the big money quiz shows of the era, $64,000 Question, Dotto, 21, they all play a part of this, which we will explain on an upcoming show. I think you'll find that one very interesting as well. But that's coming down the road somewhere. I hope you will check me out on Twitter. Easy to find me. Full name, Shawn Wilsie, ShawnWilsie. And on Instagram at SWilsie, SWilsie. Thank you I'm so happy that you downloaded this edition of Are We On The Air. It means a lot to me that you've done so. Love your reviews. This has been a King Bobby production.
This part of Another World was brought to you by Ivory, the soap without a lot of extra ingredients. For a pure, natural kind of clean, lather up with Ivory.
Yes, I know, Travis. That's why we give such bargains.